Hello, my name is James Trost, and this is A2 Insight. Today's guest is Mr. Al Blixt, a higher education consultant here in Ann Arbor, and from my research, a lot of other things. So, Al Blixt, welcome to A2 Insight.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I'm just delighted to be here.
Good. Well, we're very glad to have you here. Why don't you start out by just giving us information about your background, where you grew up, early family influences, and let's take you all the way up to the completion of your academic career. So why don't we just start with that?
Hokey smokes. All right. Born in Detroit, raised in the northern suburbs of Detroit, came to the University of Michigan to go to college, met and married the most wonderful woman in the world. We just celebrated 50 years of marriage,
Yeah,
so
wonderful.
That's kind of cool. Well, I studied philosophy as an undergraduate, and then I went to law school. So that's like as far as we can go as far as my academic background. I don't know.
All right. Well, what interested you in philosophy as opposed to other disciplines?
Well, number one, I got A's, which was important. But actually, the reason that philosophy was so interesting is because it really is the framework. It's to allow people to develop a thoughtful point of view in making decisions about how to live your life and how to figure out how to operate and be effective in the world. It prepared me well for my law school training, and it has stood me in good stead ever since.
Well, then, after you completed your law school, you began, it looks like you had started an organization yourself right out of law school, or I don't know what you did anything with law, but something called Blixt and Associates. What did you do after you graduated from law school?
Oh, this is complicated. All right. Yes, my wife and I worked my way through law school as a professional photographer, and we were doing photography and graphic arts. And we made enough money out of our house in my last year of law school. We said, hey, let's be entrepreneurs. Let's go open a business. And so for those of you that are familiar with the South University area, 555 South Forest was a new office building right across from where the Village Corner used to be. So we had our first office there, and eventually, after a few years, we moved down to the Nichols Arcade. We spent 9 years there, upstairs, right above Van Boven's Shoes, for those of you that are familiar with that geography. And what had started out as a small organization with myself, my wife, and 2 other people, some other things happened. We ended up moving down next to Community High at the Brower Building, which is a phenomenal building, brand new building at the time. And our little agency grew into a big agency. And we were the #2 ad agency in Ann Arbor at that time, and mostly representing service organizations. So we represented St. Joe's Hospital, the Apple Bank, for those of you that remember Huron Valley National Bank. We represented eventually about a dozen hospitals in the Midwest doing radio, television, outdoor, that sort of thing. So there's one track that's running that, for about 20 years we had that business. But that business had its ups and downs, and so for a while, we needed a secondary income. So I left the agency and became a prosecuting attorney. I did that for 5 years. I worked for Bill Delhay, who was the legendary prosecutor more than 30 years in Washtenaw County. So I ended up doing a lot of trial work. I lived my life in the courtroom for 5 years, which, by the way, is a very good training for stand-up presentation. At the same time, I was moonlighting as an adjunct at Eastern Michigan University, and I had an offer at one point to become a professor. So for 5 years, I was a professor at Eastern in the business school. So all of that was, the past is prologue. And so by the end of the 1980s, we had grown enough so that my wife and I, who had no training in management, decided we needed to hire some consultants to help us figure out our management plan for the agency. So Blixt Associates had about 22 people at that point. And right across the hall from us at the Brower Building was this brand new consulting firm called Dana Miller Tyson Associates. We hired them, and my first experience with organizational change was as a client. Ultimately, my life has been shaped the last 25 years as a partner in Dana Miller Tyson Associates, doing organizational change work for the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, the United States Air Force, GM, Ford, Chrysler, and so what I have been in the business of doing since 1995 is helping organizations figure out where they are, where they want to go, and how they're going to get there.
Well, that's an interesting area to start, because given your own, you've had quite a bit of change in your own career. Not only, I mean, I didn't realize that you did work as a prosecutor. I did know that you did some adjunct work at Eastern. Now, does the Dana Miller just happen to pop in across the hall? I mean,
well, they had just taken office
kind
space.
Of thing?
Well, I'd known Kathy Dana Miller. For those of us who are Ann Arbor townies, may not know that Kathleen Dana Miller, who was at one point the president of the Ann Arbor School Board, she worked at Eastern or at the University of Michigan, but Kathy was the mother of the Ark Coffee House. She was the person who was helped. It was part of the forming of the Ark, which is now over 50 years now. So I had been the photographer for the Ark in the late 70s. So Kathy and I knew each other then. And one day, well, in 87, when we did this retreat, that was my first exposure to what later became a methodology that we call whole-scale change. But so that happened, and that retreat happened, and I was impressed, but we kept on going, and then the agency went on for a few more years. But one day in 1995, Kathleen, who I had known for many years, called me up and said, "Al, I'm looking for partners. I think you'd be good at this. Why don't you come and join me?" And so with an invitation like that, how could I say no? And the result was I got a chance to be involved with organizational change for organizations all around the country and a little bit outside the country, but mostly in the United States. And we've been worked in healthcare and banking and energy and high tech and the automotive industry and the federal government. And so the opportunity to bring about change, to actually facilitate change and help empower people to change their organization for the better was something that doesn't get old.
Well, and it's definitely something that isn't easy. Most people don't like change at all in their lives, and certainly most organizations that I'm familiar with or have worked with, the idea that someone's coming in from the outside to change the organization isn't necessarily well received. So how does this happen when you're...
So let's be clear. It's not the consultant that brings about the change.
Right.
The people have to figure out what they want. And my job is to align, organize, convene the whole system. And so one of the things that we have gotten very good at is bringing whole systems together. So it's, we've done, I've done meetings of 500, 1,000, 1,500 people, where it surprises people you can actually get work done with that many people, and there's a methodology that lets you do that.
Well, and that's interesting because, again, working with Dana Miller, you've got his connection with her and working in the ARC, which, of course, I believe you're on the board of.
I was on the board for about 25 years.
Which, of course, for those of us know, is you get some great acts coming into our community. But then moving on between, again, the organizational change, working with different organizations, then you have your own change coming along, and in 2010 you started your own organization, which is called New Campus Dynamics. So I'd like to kind of get into what is the impetus for New Campus Dynamics and what service does it provide?
Okay. New Campus Dynamics was founded because of another old friend of mine who I'd known for many years, a guy named Larry Smith. Larry was for many years the vice president for marketing and university affairs at Eastern Michigan. He was a very accomplished, well-recognized national leader, and I'd known Larry for a long time. Larry retired, and he flunked retirement because he couldn't not work. So he called me up one day and said, "Al, I think if we could put together what I know about higher education and what you know about organizational change, we could make a real difference in the field of higher education. And as a result of that, he and I, for the last 10 years, have been going around the country helping organizations, college and university presidents, and the people of those institutions to adapt, to change, to get ready to face a future that is about as uncertain as you could possibly imagine. If there was ever a sector that needed transformation, it's higher ed.
Well, and I think that's where we're going to start to take it, because I do have this community, as well as from my own background as well, the interest in higher education and its role not only in our society today but also in the future. You have kind of a first-hand seat there in terms of dealing with organizations. So I guess having worked, I mean, you really are in a unique position. You've worked with governmental agencies, you've worked with the healthcare industry in terms of dealing with organizational change. What are some of the greatest challenges faced by the higher education industry in the coming years?
Well, where do I begin? Let me tell you that there are mega trends that are going to impact how higher education institutions do. Number one, who we teach. The demographics of the student of tomorrow are going to be very different than the demographics of the student of today. That's partly because we're going to have fewer 18-year-olds graduating from high school. Beginning in a few years, there's going to be a dramatic drop in the number if you look at the population bubble. So that means that you can't get by with just 18-year-olds coming out of high school. There's going to be increasing competition for that market. So adult learners and continuing education are going to become part of the thing. Number two, what we teach. We got to worry about who we teach. We got to worry about what we teach. What we teach means developing a curriculum that has relevance for employers who are going to want people who are prepared to start work right away. And the fact is that in many cases we're teaching stuff that was true 5 years ago, but it's not true today.
Could you give an example of something that's not?
An example is one of the folks that I've known for years, a man named Michael Arena. Michael just was just up until recently the chief talent officer for General Motors. So when I talk to Michael, he says, looking for talent is a real challenge because I could hire 100 engineers who were knowledgeable in the design of autonomous vehicles. Guess what? There aren't such things. We are having to train them ourselves. We create our own courses because the engineering, send me the best and the brightest of your engineering schools, but they do not necessarily have the expertise that we are going to need, right? So that's an example. The idea that industry may be ahead of academia in certain areas or the needs may be greater, that's part of the problem. So who we teach, what we teach, where we teach. The fact is that we are increasingly moving to an on-demand, online world, and so we are going to have to figure out how to deliver the educational experience and not necessarily in a classroom, or if in a classroom, in a different way of doing that face-to-face interaction with professors. It won't be the professor standing at the bottom of the well in the big lecture hall and holding forth for an hour. That's not, they're not buying that.
Right. Well, I mean, given the reality, and I've ran an interesting statistic here, that the tuition, average public school tuition has risen over 200% in the last 30 years. And a lot of that money went to buy brand new, beautiful buildings on campus, physical education departments, the student loan increases. What you're basically saying is that a lot of these institutions, with the increase in tuition dollars subsidized by the federal government, spent a lot of that money on more traditional forms of education. What's going to happen to all these classrooms after there's any need for them?
Well, I don't think we're ever going to run out of the need for brick and mortar education. But where I think we might be headed is, imagine if there were 100 students in the universe of higher education and we were looked out 10 years from now, 30 of them never came to campus. They enrolled online. This is Arizona State University has 100 online courses. You don't have to touch the campus. So maybe a third of students will do that. Another third will take some of their classes online and will come to class we'll do labs, we'll do other kinds of things. So there'll be a hybrid version of that. And then there are plenty of people who, just between you and me, come to college to grow up. They come to meet people that don't look like them. They come to have experiences, to try out, to figure. This is the 18-year-old journey to adulthood. You know, that experience of being in a classroom, having to figure out how to study, all of that stuff, plus the social interaction that takes place. And for a lot of 18-year-olds, going to a football game and all the other fun things that go on over the weekend is part of that college experience. So there will always be a place for it. I think we're going to see less and less need for or at least it'll be a changing configuration of the traditional classroom for sure.
Well, maybe I'll try to be a little bit more specific. Let's say I'm the president of a small liberal arts college in the middle of nowhere. I have 1,500 students on campus, full-time faculty, maybe 100, maybe a staff of 200 people, and I'm trying to compete in the larger world against schools that are not in the rural areas. I mean, we've got literally thousands of additionally church-related institutions that are studying liberal arts. I have professors teaching courses that students aren't taking because they're not getting a job. I've contacted New Campus Visions, and I'm interested in changing my institution. Why would I contact you as the president of this small college that's struggling?
Well, New Campus Dynamics offers two things: a process for planning and expert advice. Don't have to follow it, but here are options of things you could consider. Our work is about, I mean, most places are going to have a strategic plan. It's on the shelf. It's not having an impact. So part of what we do is say, okay, well, let's take a look at that plan. Let's take a look at what's right about it. But let's figure out how to engage faculty, students, and staff in figuring out what does this organization, what does this institution need to become. And so if you're the president of the small liberal arts college, which are in some ways the most at risk, you know, anybody who has less than 2,000 students, the business model, the financial model, it says unless you have a big endowment, you're in trouble. If enrollment just drops a little bit, you're going to be laying people off. So the idea is to figure out how to create a unique identity, something that will be based around the experience. And there is going to be, you're going to need, I think, a mixed portfolio. There's going to be an on-campus component of people who want to be part of that university college community. And they want to have a learning experience. They want to be involved in the interaction that takes place with other fellow students and with faculty members and all of that. Every place is different. And you're going to need to figure out how do you deliver, because essentially, if we were going to try and figure out the three things that have to be present for students to stick around. And the problem that many of these schools face is attrition. The retention rate is a problem. It's not unusual for any of these schools to have an entering class, let's say you have 100 people, the chances are only 65 of them will be around the start of the sophomore year. So you're losing a third of your students between the first and the second year. Why is that? Social reasons. They don't feel comfortable, they didn't ever adjusted, moving away from home, whatever. Academic reasons, couldn't do the work, didn't like the work. Financial reasons. So unless you can solve the social, academic, and financial puzzle, the Rubik's Cube, for every different kind of student, and this is the great difficulty, is you're going to have to figure out how, because some of those students, if you've got, you know, we have like 1 million vets, you know, and so all these people that have been, you know, done 2 tours in Afghanistan who are coming back to get a master's degree, they're not looking for the traditional college experience. They're not going to a Friday night kegger, right? They've got a family, they want the degree, and they understand discipline, they understand hard work, they're mature, right? What do they need? Or do we have a veterans program on campus? Are we looking at figuring out how to not see everything through the stereotype of the 18-year-old freshman? So all of that says, this is again coming back to who we teach, what we teach, where we teach, and how we teach. That, all of that is going to change over time.
Well, and another thing that's changed, we've had guests on here in the past that have talked about just the globalization of higher education, and the priorities of the international students may not be the same as ours, or the focus areas. They're much more science oriented, they're more engineering, technology, as opposed to American students. So the idea of the international, this is mainly also a lot of schools' solution to the problem of the declining enrollment has gone just to go for international students, full-paying students. At the same time, that may not necessarily positively impact certain departments on campuses, majors like religious studies, music, theater, things like that. Given how you mentioned initially how people want something, employers want to have people targeted, what is the future of the liberal arts major itself?
That's a really good question. I would say that for me, as a product of the liberal arts education, right? Having studied ethics, logic, the philosophy of religion, the philosophy of science, political philosophy, having studied those things as an undergraduate, I have a frame of reference in which to pick and choose what's important and what's not. If I ran the world, and believe me, I do not, but if I ran the world, I would say, let's figure out how to create a truly integrated, interdisciplinary liberal arts curriculum that is specifically aimed at creating people who could really do analytical thinking because they understand enough about history and enough about philosophy and enough about science and enough about, goodness gracious, world geography. There's a lot that people have to have perspective. So from my standpoint, the way you deliver value as a university is to create an environment where people can really discover their talents and figure out how they can learn to apply those talents usefully in the world.
Well, it does kind of go back to your whole concept of the talent acquisition of engineers. Is having maybe some coursework in philosophy more advantageous? And the reason that I think that's important too is that we do live in a world with as I said, changing curriculum itself has to meet the demands, and our model of it is World War II and everything else. So, how do you integrating that when you've got even departments are very protective of their curriculum? These are. I'm just going back to these are issues you're dealing with.
Right. So the issues that I'm dealing with, for the president of a university. Not the University of Michigan. I've worked a lot at U of M.
We haven't gone there yet.
They don't have a problem with enrollment, right? For sure. But if you are any of the regional publics in this state, Eastern Michigan, Central Michigan, if anything that has a direction in its name, those institutions do have to pay attention to enrollment. They have to pay attention to the balance between tuition and balancing the books and all of that. It's a very complex algorithm that they have to go through. So from where I sit, the real question is, how do we create a mix of students with an adaptive curriculum presented in a way that allows people to learn and grow in a way that meets their life goals? And so some people are mature. Some of us were not when we came to college. I think that's a given. So from my standpoint, the future of the liberal arts has to be designed to provide relevance to the world. And the result of my education, and I think the result of, for a lot of people, and if you take a look around at who the leaders of the Fortune 500 are and ask how many of them were business majors and how many of them studied something else, I think you'll find a significant proportion studied something else. So, but for a student who's saying, I got to get a job, they're asking themselves, well, what good is the philosophy major? What could I do with that? Well, my answer is you can go to law school, right? You can do a lot of things, right? So the idea of, I think, dispelling the notion that the liberal arts are irrelevant to the real world, that is, I think, a monumental task, and it has to do with how you present it, how you organize it, how you track the data. Because if you take a look at students who are 5 years out from graduation, and you ask them, so like, did your major prepare you, right? And then you present that data to incoming freshmen, there's a good chance that they will say, oh, well, now I see that I'm going to be taking pre-med, and it doesn't prevent me from studying poetry.
Right. Well, and I get we could go on this subject for a while, but it is a question that it relates to higher education, because it's one of the few industries that's been able to get away with raising its prices substantially without any real justification. It seems to me it's not based on inflation. It hasn't really been, and I guess that's kind of been a double-edged sword. But I mean, if you look at these statistics, what other industry has had its rates increase? Why did they get away with that for 30 years? When I went to college, tuition was, and room and board and everything was $5,000. Now it's 4 times as much. Why did that happen?
Well, I mean, the short answer for public education, for the public universities, is that the society stopped funding public education. We fund K-12, no problem. But we used to pay, the University of Michigan's budget used to be, 30, 40 years ago, dominated by state legislative appropriations. The idea is the shift that has taken place, that society no longer views college education as a public good, and preparing a workforce is not a public good. It's a private good, and if a private good isn't, it needs to be paid for by private money. And so the result is that the University of Michigan, the percentage of the university's budget that comes from the state legislature is less than 10%, as far as I know. So that means you only got 2 places to go: tuition, donors. And if you're University of Michigan, research, right? But if you're Kalamazoo College, research not so much, okay? So the result is that we've got a situation where society is going to make the person receiving the benefit bear the cost. And so when the cost of education is actually the result of the defunding of the public component of higher education. And similarly, there is, I don't know if you live in Ann Arbor, look around and see how many tall buildings you see in town, and ask yourself, what is going on in those tall buildings? They're all student apartments, right? With 70-inch TVs, and so quality of life is an important value in some institutions, and so students are willing to pay top dollar for that. But in the smaller institutions, there is this competition for facilities. And so we've got the market is demanding, and this is those who can pay are demanding it. I mean, I lived in a basement of an old house, and when I was in school, and I was happy because it was cheap, but you don't find students who are interested in that anymore.
Well, and I think the other component to that is that students weren't graduating with $40,000 or $50,000 in debt when they were graduating with a 4-year liberal arts degree. And so the demand on the part of not only the students but on their families, whether they're living in a basement or a high rise, is that it goes back to the institution. What am I getting for this investment of my money? And the institutions have not answered that question.
Well, and the reality is that you take off the top 150 institutions in the country who've got no financial problems, really. That leaves 3,000 institutions that have to worry about balancing the budget. And I was on a campus a couple of weeks ago that was a beautiful campus built in the 1960s, all at once. I mean, they're just gorgeous, architecturally designed, and the maintenance that was deferred for 25 years is now coming back to haunt that institution. And so they're spending millions to retrofit electrical, plumbing, air conditioning, stuff you can't even see, right? So we managed to hold down tuition for years, and then suddenly not so much. So the answer is college is unaffordable. We got to do something about it. There's no question about that. People should not be coming out of school looking at 10, 20, 30 years of student loan payments. That's just unacceptable. The reality is that the institutions are, to some degree, trapped because their revenue sources are limited, that they're tuition dependent, and as a result of that, you know, and there's a push, you know, it's very rare. I mean, you're right, there's a lot of buildings going up, but there's also a lot of schools that are struggling with deferred maintenance.
Sure.
So it's not an easy problem. You know, if you don't have, and I don't mean to be too negative here, but if you think that administrative fat is the problem in the school, and then ask yourself, how many suicides did you have on campus last year? And do you have any mental health counselors who you employ to deal with that? So the idea, the number of wraparound services that you need in terms of health care, mental health, all of that, and career planning, all of that stuff costs money. And it is not reflected in necessarily in faculty costs. So, so the needs of the current population of students in a very stressful environment are part of the problem. But there's no argument that we cannot keep doing what we're doing in terms of college costs. Absolutely got to change.
Well, and this is a good overview. I'm going to move on to something else now, because one of the reasons I was interested in having you on the program, and we are doing a kind of a series here on various communities in Ann Arbor that we don't talk very much about. And one of the organizations you're involved with is called Intentional Communities. And I did some research on this because I was fascinated. I know several people who deal with adults with various disabilities, long-term disability, life-term disabilities, and I was fascinated and came across this something in our community that I think it's important we know more about, and that's called Intentional Communities. So if you could just give me some information about this organization, what its mission statement is, and what is your involvement in this organization?
An organization that is near and dear to my heart. In 1983, my wife and I had a child born at 1 pound 10 ounces, 3.5 months premature, not expected to live. He survived as one of the few super preemies at his age. Today, most of those kids survive. Andrew was, at the time of his birth, oxygen deprived because his little lungs were not doing it. So he has brain damage. He's developmentally disabled. He is now 36 years old and lives independently in his own apartment with staff. He volunteers for Meals on Wheels and the food gatherers, and he is a useful member of society even though he cannot hold down a job. We saw that, and we've worked, I lived through the whole special education curriculum. I have a long term from the time Andrew was 3 and entered a pre-primary program, all the way through the end of his stay with the public school system, which in Michigan, thankfully, is at 26. But 15 years ago, with other parents, we said, these kids are going to need a community because they need to have social interaction, and we want them to live in an independent environment as much as possible. So we gathered together a group of parents. We probably have started out talking to 20 or 30 families, but we ended up with 5 that decided that what we really wanted is to create a model for improving the quality of life of persons with developmental disabilities, allowing them to live as independently as possible. So we currently have about 25 residents who most of them have their own place, a few of them have roommates, but about half are in condominiums on the west side of Ann Arbor, and about half of them, like my son, live in an apartment also on the west side of Ann Arbor. And the idea of intentional communities was to create a social network where people are living independently in their own homes. They have staff that's paid for by the government. But the fundamental idea of intentional communities is to create that social bond. And so we, as an organization, provide what are called community builders. And these are individuals who provide the kind of social coaching for the group. And each one of them has 6 to 8 people who are part of their little pod, their little community. In return for their services, and they work 20 hours a week, mostly overnight and weekends, they get free housing. So we provide them, they can hold down day jobs, but they convene a community dinner every Monday night. My son was the host last night. They plan social activities, they go on outings, and we have monthly potlucks, we have periodic other events. We'll have a big Halloween party. We'll have a winter formal out at Barton Hills in February where all the kids, and they're not all kids anymore, but there are children, all dress up. So the idea of intentional communities is to provide quality of life infrastructure for people to maintain a connection with people who are similarly situated. So it's been, and I had the pleasure of being the board president for 7 years.
Right. Well, and I think this is an area of interest and concern too, particularly with people with developmental or some form of disabilities. I know one of my dear friends has an autistic son who has never really ventured away from the family. He wants to provide in case that, yes, he's getting older, the concern of what is going to happen when this is someone who really physically and mentally cannot function on their own. It's interesting how that a lot of these folks really don't leave their immediate family. And so I guess the question in the long term, it's helping with the socialization. This is an important part because you're dealing with a population that really doesn't have much social interaction or doesn't necessarily have any employment. What happens, what is the long-term goal for these folks when, for instance, in your own instance, I'm sure that is a concern.
It has crossed our mind.
Is this the lay of life for the future?
Well, here's the thing, part of the reason for forming intentional communities was to make sure that there was a community when mom and dad are gone. And so what's going to happen to an individual, they need to form their own circle. There's going to be siblings, aunts, uncles, friends. They need to be ready to pick up the mantle of that. They also need to do financial planning. Maybe there would be a trust that would be funded. In our case, will be funded by life insurance. And so one of the local banks will administer all of his financial needs. But his older brother is in Chicago, and he's not. It's not a good idea to uproot Andrew, and it's not a good idea to ask my my son to take over. So the idea will be to create an environment in which the family looks out for the individual, but also our community looks out for the individual. And so he will have the people around him. He will have his social life will be more or less intact. And if you were to try to keep up with my son Andrew, Monday he bowls, Tuesday he goes to an exercise class, Wednesday he goes horseback riding. His social life is full. And so his life, although he comes home every weekend, so it's not like we don't see him. He's home Friday night to Sunday night. So then we go out and we do all kinds of fun things over the weekend. But for Andrew, we want to make sure there is continuity and stability. And it will be a combination of what the family can provide and what the community can provide.
Well, and it certainly is a need in our community to have something like this. I will, for people who may know of someone in a similar situation, we're going to be getting the website of Intentional Communities at the end of the program too, as well as information on new campus dynamics. Al Blixt, I really want to thank you for being a guest today on A2 Insight. It's been very interesting. I feel like we've only touched the surface, but I think we've got a good info. You've got a lot of various entrepreneurial activities, and you're looking forward to more organizational change challenges, I suppose, in the future.
Well, we're trying to save higher education in one institution at a time.
Well, you've got your hands full then. So again,
Right.
for A2 Insight, until next time, I'm James Trost.